Before we start, I would just like to thank my camera person, M, for helping to record me at some sections of my walk. I recommend reading the introductory text above this video on the WordPress blog, as it contains important context as to how this vlog is structured and how walking specifically was used in the creation of this vlog. Now, on to the video. Let's have a quick look at the map of my walk. This walk was originally 9.4 kilometers long and took exactly 4 hours and 24 minutes according to the GPS app I used to record it, starting at Hyde Park Corner and ending outside Chancery Lane Station. However, due to the amount of material, I have decided to focus on the first 2.4 kilometers of my walk, as that encapsulates the themes of my blog in a more manageable size. I knew that I wanted to start my walk in Hyde Park Corner, as it's the perfect place to help answer the main question of my walk, which is, a walk through central London, what can it tell us about how military history is publicly remembered? I started my walk next to the equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington, so this is where I told my camera person to meet me. From there, I began to walk clockwise around the pedestrian roundabout that essentially is Hyde Park Corner. It's immediately obvious that this small, roughly 430 metre circle is absolutely packed with a large number of public military memorials. After the one I started at, I passed by the Machine Gun Corps Memorial, between the many jet black slabs of the New Zealand War Memorial, under the Wellington Arch, past the water-covered Australia War Memorial, and finally arrived at the Royal Artillery Memorial. That's a lot of memorials. I was initially struck by the thought that they appear to be purposefully placed to create a walking experience that emphasises the connection between the memorials, and to create a sense of repeated victory against Britain's military foes at a great cost. Yet, on closer inspection, there are many signs that suggest that this cannot be the full story. Most notably, the New Zealand and Australian memorials are constructed in a much more contemporary interactive manner. Additionally, the path from the Wellington Arch to the Australian Memorial is not direct, requiring one to either skip walking under the arch against the flow of the crowd, or awkwardly turn around just afterwards if you wish to experience all these sights in a continuous path. This contradicted my initial impression because the walk around Hyde Park Corner appeared to create a mythscape, upon which the multiple and often conflicting nationalist narratives are rewritten, which is a perpetually mutating repository for the representation of the past for the purposes of the present. In other words, I've effectively walked past 3 different pairs of memorials, where the new ones have built off the older ones. The first ones are the post-Napoleonic Wellington memorials. It's clear that they constitute a pair, from the way that the crowd of mainly tourists was walking along the main path between them, as well as their shared focus on a single great man. Next came the monuments dedicated to entire sections of the British Home Forces, but crucially not the forces of the British Empire. This is evident from the fact that the Artillery Memorial makes no mention of theatres where Imperial forces such as the Imam-Sadeque troops fought without much assistance from the United Kingdom. For example, the New Guinea campaign in World War II. The figures here are much more sombre than the triumphal poses of the Wellington pair. They emphasise the greater focus on the human cost of war, yet the fact that they occupied a shared space connected by walkways hopes to maintain a sense that they're part of a bigger narrative of British victory. Lastly, the most recent pair, the Imam-Sadeque memorials, are a bit awkwardly squeezed in. The Australia one was built in 2003 and the New Zealand one was built in 2006, which explains why my path around the area wasn't a perfect circle, as the Australian memorial had to be fit in the corner as best as possible. This also explains why the Imam-Sadeque memorials are a lot more interactive compared to the older ones, given their postmodernist styles. At a distance, the New Zealand memorial is shaped like the sterns of Maori canoes, reminding us of the voyages of the original Polynesian people. However, as one walks around each pillar and looks up close, more details are visible, such as a script in the Maori language or traditional symbols. Similarly, the Australian Memorial's large text names battles important to the Australian people during the World Wars. But, on a closer look, the letters dissolve into much smaller and more numerous towns and cities where the Australian servicemen came from. The fact that they're located amongst British monuments makes it clear to anyone who visits that Britain's victory was not only due to the losses of the people of the UK, but of other distinct peoples as well. In this way, from just a small starting section of my walk, we can see that over the last 200 years, outdoor public memorials have become more diverse and inclusive, shifting from the great man narrative towards the recognition of the contributions of the ordinary soldier, and more recently, paying homage to those various peoples who died because of Britain's wars, who weren't from Britain itself. Before leaving Hyde Park Corner, as I was walking to the crossing towards the main park, I noticed two things. The first one was the continued presence of the Remembrance Day poppy wreaths around the Royal Artillery Memorial in December, but no one who walked past me wearing poppies anymore. Keep this in mind because it will be a relevant point of comparison during a different part of my walk. Another thing that I noticed was a whole group of journalists who ran past me to document a protest that had emerged at the base of the equestrian statue in the 10 minutes that it took to walk this small loop. I could not hear what they were talking about, and I didn't want to stay too long due to the rapidly escalating police response. In theory, this should all be irrelevant to my walk since I'm focused on public military remembrance. However, the protesters were using the residual power of this symbolic memorial space for the more contemporary expression of grief, mourning and protest. To great success, as journalists and a growing crowd of ordinary pedestrians such as myself were halting their journeys to take pictures of them against the backdrop of the Statue of Wellington. They were clearly trying to suggest that their cause was as noble as important as Wellington's campaign against the French. Though, the power of the image of them being the torchbearers of liberty, from the gentlemen generals of old, was undermined by the fact that their megaphone didn't work. Continuing northeastern, I headed across Knightsbridge Road, past the southern gate of Hyde Park proper, before turning left onto South Carriage Drive. Noticing that there was a sudden depression in the black fence that ran otherwise parallel on the other side of the drive, I decided to cross to see what was the reason for this suspicious dip. It turned out that the fence went back about a metre, hiding a hard-to-notice concrete plaque in the ground, dedicated to the memory of the victims of the 1982 IRA bombing in Hyde Park Corner that killed 4 soldiers as well as 7 cavalry horses. The quite literal low profile could be the result of the fact that many of the surviving victims and relatives very clearly are not pleased that the primary suspect, named Gilbert McNamee, has remained free due to legal complications. As a result, there are still marches down South Carriage Drive, though none on this day. It's understandable that the victims might not want to be obviously reminded of an injustice that from their perspective has not yet been laid to rest. Continuing westwards, I turned north at Albert's Gate onto an unnamed park path, just before I was about to turn right onto a different perpendicular unnamed path. My camera person wanted to cut across the grass as she wanted me to take a picture of her against an aesthetically pleasing rock. That's why we were both extremely surprised after walking up to the rock to find out that on the side of it that was not visible to us from the path, there was an inscription detailing this site as the Holocaust Memorial. I was surprised at discovering a wholly unexpected reminder of the Holocaust was by design though, as when it was opened in 1983, it was praised by a survivor of the Holocaust for being a good example of a Holocaust memorial which uses its simple design to appear welcoming. No matter which direction or path you were walking on, it looks like a randomly placed boulder or is obscured by the nearby birch trees purposely planted simultaneously with the rock. There is nothing that identifies it as being connected to the Holocaust, so there's no time to mentally prepare yourself to think about such a macabre topic. Coupled with the sudden disappearance of grass around the rock, also created on purpose, the striking difference beckons the curious to take a closer look. It's worth remembering this was designed in 1983, before a quick look at Google Maps could spoil the surprise, so it would have been even more effective at being a mysterious draw for its intended audience of 1980s Britain. Then, when you turn a corner, the true purpose of the site sticks with you just a bit more than it would otherwise. It's an effective way at keeping the memory of the Holocaust fresh through positive deception by encouraging those not looking for it to ponder its meaning. After that experience, there was no choice but to rejoin the dirt path that heads through the rose garden, given my footwear wasn't great for grass. Walking another 300 metres, I turned right onto Serpentine Road. Then shortly followed by the next left, and then right, till we were alongside the A4202 for the next 800 metres. As I was about to cross into Upper Brook Street, I had to halt on an island in the middle of the A4202. On that island was this, the Animals in War Memorial. Unlike the first memorials at Hyde Park Corner, there were few people stopping to look, possibly because the Wellington Arch alone is famous enough to draw in crowds alongside being the entrance to Buckingham Palace. Whereas being located in what's essentially a traffic island means that most people did not want to miss the opportunity to cross the road at the Animal War Memorial. This is slightly unfortunate, since according to its official website, the sculptor created it with the intention to attract those walking by to come stop and go through the steps in between to make them reflect on the vast number of animals that died during 20th century wars. Other than myself and my camera person, in the 7 minutes we waited and filmed there, with hundreds crossing past, likely to get to and from Hyde Park's Winter Wonderland. Only one couple stopped for about 10 seconds, took a selfie, and then walked off. Just goes to show that design alone cannot force people to engage with historical remembrance, but only offer the choice. Other than the poor location, there are a few things to note. Remember when I previously mentioned the poppy reefs at the Artillery Memorial? Well, there were a bunch here too, except many of these ones were purple. Although not as well known as the red poppies, purple poppies have been used as symbol of remembrance for the animal victims in Britain's world wars since the year on screen right now. The majority of those laid by the Artillery Memorial were from the current and active British military regiments, or military or diplomatic services of nations that were allies in World War II, like India and Canada. Whereas the wreaths at the Animal Memorial were largely from animal welfare charities. This is a good example of how having diverse sites for public outdoor remembrance has benefits, as different groups have a spot to honour what memories matter to them. It's also worth mentioning the date of the construction of this monument, November 2004, as this closely aligns with the construction of the Australia and New Zealand memorials. Considering that all the British war memorials that we've passed so far have been built prior to the 21st century, this might suggest that, although it's a small sample size, we're shifting away from military remembrance being a solely domestic and even solely anthropocentric towards being more diverse. The inclusion of non-humans as an agent within history themselves is a relatively new phenomenon, emerging only with the rise of environmental history in the 1960s. Perhaps this is a sign that in the future, animal memorials might be considered as important as Wellington's arches to us nowadays. Before we finish, there is one thing I want to consider, which is how many military historical related events have taken place on the roads which I've just walked on. Just taking a look at the number of World War II bombing sites alone on my route, within the time period of the 7th of October 1940, the 6th of June 1941, as that's all that's available on the online archive I was using, bombsite.org. Let's use this map to show all the bombing sites I would have passed by. To simplify the estimate, let's assume that the map of London has the same layout of buildings. To simplify the estimate, let's assume that the map of Blitz-era London. To simplify the estimate, let's assume that the map of World War II Blitz-era London has the same layout of buildings and roads as my route today, and that I could have seen the remains of any bombing site that happened within 100 metres of my route. Given these criteria, then in the 2.52 km length of my walk, I would have walked past 63 bombing sites. Yet during my walk, neither the streets, nor buildings,
nor park showed any evidence that this part of London suffered from the Blitz, despite this being one of the most heavily bombed areas of London due to its proximity to Buckingham Palace. It does show us that not everything will be remembered or even given a plaque in the physical world. Perhaps because it's too numerous, perhaps because we want to move on from it, perhaps just because there isn't any space for it to be there. With that all said, I hope you learned something from my vlog and my walk today. Good night and goodbye.